All right, folks, so this is the new Apple Watch Series 10. So this is their 10th generation of Apple Watch, and this year they've brought improvements on the hardware end of things with larger cases, larger displays, as well as the ability to track snorkeling. So with each year's Apple Watch release, they don't usually reinvent the wheel. Rather, they make refinements and improvements to something that's pretty tried and true. And these new upgrades are pretty nice, but there is another side of the story each year, and that's what they bring out with their new version of watchOS. And with watchOS 11, there's some pretty big features on the sports and health side of things, like the ability to track training load, the new Vitals app, true offline topo maps, and then most recently their sleep apnea notification feature. So in this video, we're going to go over everything new with the Apple Watch Series 10 from a hardware standpoint, but also talk about some of the newest features that just rolled out with watchOS 11. And I think that should give you kind of a good gauge on whether you should upgrade or not from a previous generation Apple Watch. But along with that, just like all my reviews, I'll be going into lots of detail about the sports and fitness performance, where I have lots of data to share around heart rate accuracy, as well as GPS accuracy for stuff like running, cycling, as well as weight training. And if the information in this video does help you out at all, feel free to hit that like button down below. It's a small thing that you can do that'll help this video and the channel out quite a bit, and I appreciate it. Okay, so first up, let's talk about sizes. So they increased the case size on both the small and large versions by 1 millimeter, where the larger Series 10 is now 46 millimeters and the smaller option is 42 millimeters. And they increased it by 1 millimeter both in height as well as width. But proportionally, that does make it just slightly more square now. But in terms of the actual size difference for like wearability, I can't really see a difference from the Series 9 to the Series 10. Both of these are totally comfortable on my 185 millimeter circumference wrist. But they also made the case thinner, where they reduced the thickness by about 10%, where they're 9.7 millimeters thick now versus 10.7 millimeters on the Series 9. And that part actually is kind of noticeable, and most noticeable with sleeves, where it's just kind of slightly easier to get your cuff over the watch. Now, to get the Series 10 thinner, they basically had to shrink everything inside, including the processor to the internals of the digital crown, and they even reduced the size of the speaker by 30%, with apparently no loss in quality. But with all those changes, they also reduced the weight at the same time, where the larger Series 10 weighs around 35 grams versus around 39 grams for the Series 9, at least on my scale, and then the smaller Series 10 weighs around 29 grams versus 32 grams for the Series 9 41 millimeter. So about a 10% weight reduction in both sizes. And it's not like the Series 9 was an uncomfortable watch by any means. Actually, it was super comfortable already, but it's just that the Series 10 is even more comfortable now. But another change they made, though, is for their more premium option of the Series 10, where the Series 9 came in a stainless steel version for the more premium offering, but they've now switched that over to titanium on the Series 10. And the big difference there, again, is going to be weight, where that results in the titanium Series 10 being about 20% lighter than the stainless steel Series 9. And I don't actually have one of those on me today, but I think by the time that this video comes out, I should already have one in my hand. So stay tuned on a video for that one as well, and how that actually compares to the Ultra 2, since they actually are very close in price for that more premium offering. And then on the display side of things, so they've increased the display size on both models, where the larger 46 millimeter option now has the largest display ever on an Apple Watch. Yes, even bigger than an Ultra 2. And I'm talking about pure active display area, not the case or the top glass. The actual active pixels that you see and touch are more on the Series 10 than the Ultra 2. It's not a gigantic difference, but there is more. But I do feel there's a little bit of an optical illusion there if you look at the Ultra 2 and the Series 10 side by side, due to the surface area of the glass covering the display, where the Ultra appears bigger just because it has more glass, and also possibly because of the curves in the Series 10, where those actually kind of wrap over a little bit. But yeah, in terms of actual active pixels, there is more. But one thing that I thought was a little bit strange is that with data fields, you can only have 4 on the Series 10, but you can actually have 5 on the Ultra 2 for workouts, even though the display sizes are basically pretty similar. Now, compared to the Series 9, again, it definitely is larger, and I think that's actually noticeable while using the keyboard. It's definitely challenging on both being such a small keyboard, but it does actually feel a little bit easier to use on the Series 10. And another feature they touted this year with the display is better readability at off angles, which I think is what they call their wide angle OLED display. So there is a difference when you compare it to previous generation watches, where it's brighter and easier to see, but it does kind of depend on what's on the screen, like what kind of watch face that you have or what kind of app that you're using. Like if it's a watch face with small complications or lots of text on the screen, that can be kind of hard to make out. But one place I actually did notice a difference was when I was cycling indoors, where I actually could see the display a lot easier when my hands were on the handlebars. And yet one more update on the display side of things is with the always-on display mode, where it can now refresh once a second versus once a minute before. And they did take advantage of that with certain watch faces that will update every second, showing the seconds kind of tick by, with new watch faces like their new Reflections watch face. Now, one thing that hasn't changed with the Series 10 though is going to be battery life, where the Series 10 still gets the same 18-hour all-day battery life that Apple Watches are getting pretty well known for at this point. But I think what's also well known is that longer battery life is probably one of the most requested things from all us Apple Watch owners. Now, I do typically get more than a day out of most of my Apple Watches, like with the Series 10, while using the always-on display as well as recording about an hour-long outdoor activity per day, I usually get like 26 to 28 hours out of it before needing to recharge it. Now, for battery life specifically for recording outdoor activities, it seems to use around 10 to 12% per hour from my test, so you could potentially go record maybe like a 9-hour long outdoor activity on a full charge, and possibly longer if you turn off the always-on display mode, because I was using that on my tests. Now, one thing that does make a big difference though this year in regards to battery life is that the Series 10 has faster charging, where you can get an 80% charge from empty in just 30 minutes, which is astoundingly fast. And I think they also claim that you can get like 8 hours of use in just 15 minutes of charging. So that does make it a lot easier for those of us who get more on that 18-hour range if we want sleep tracking, which is actually going to be a really important feature this year with the new watchOS 11 features. So that's where we can just place it on a charger for a few minutes before heading to bed and still be able to track all our sleep. And then they also made an update on the speaker functionality, where the speaker can now also be used to play music or podcasts in addition to being used for calls and alerts and stuff like that. It's the quality that you would kind of expect out of a speaker that's this small, and it's probably something that should only be used in a pinch. Now, one concern I do have about this feature is kind of related to that person that uses their Bluetooth speaker in public when it's not really appropriate, but the volume doesn't really get all that loud, and when you do crank it up, the quality isn't really all that awesome. So I guess we'll just kind of have to see how this pans out. And then on the hardware end of things for sports specifically, so the highlight feature with the Series 10 is that it has a depth gauge that can track depths down to 3 meters or around 20 feet, which also allows it to be used for snorkeling with the Oceanic Plus app. Now, I haven't been able to actually get the Oceanic Plus app to actually work with the Series 10 quite yet, plus I don't really have an ideal place to snorkel here when I live in Colorado, so I'm going to have to follow up on that a little bit later on down the road. However, the depth sensor still definitely works, at least in the pool, and also tells me the temperature in the water. Now, even though the depth gauge goes down to 3 meters or 20 feet, the Series 10 still does have a water resistance rating down to 50 meters. It's just that the depth gauge only works down to 3 meters or 20 feet. And then another update on the water sports side of things is that they also have a new Tides app with watchOS 11, where it can show swells and other weather information for beaches all around the world. Now, I don't really have a use for this being in Colorado, but I do have to say that this app is great from a design standpoint. So it's easy to understand, it gives lots of information, and quite frankly, it's just kind of fun to play around with, where they have these really nice, fantastic animations when scrolling through the 7 days of tide information that it can provide. And then they also introduced a ton of other new features with watchOS 11 back at WWDC earlier this year, like their new effort rating for workouts and their new training load feature, as well as a new Vitals app for tracking health metrics when you sleep. Really great features on the training and recovery side of things, and I've got an entire other video where I went into all the details of those, and I'll have that video linked down in the description below. But the biggest new feature that they announced alongside the release of the Series 10 is the ability to track sleep apnea. So sleep apnea is a condition when someone may stop breathing on occasion throughout the night, and it's not only disruptive to sleep, but also can lead to other issues like type 2 diabetes, hypertension, as well as cardiac issues. Now, what's interesting though, of the millions, if not billions of people who actually suffer from it, something like 80% of us don't know we actually have it. So being that it's just built into the Series 10 as well as the Series 9 and Ultra 2 with watchOS 11, that's pretty big that more people can actually start to be aware if they possibly have sleep apnea. And you will have to enable sleep apnea tracking, but the process is really easy, where you just go into the health app on your phone, go to the Browse tab on the right-hand side, then go to respiratory, and then down to breathing disturbances. And then from here, you'll just go through this short onboarding process where they'll ask you if you're 18 years or older and if you've ever been diagnosed with sleep apnea in the past. And then from there, just sleep with your watch. And then after a 30-day period, you'll get a report on any disturbances that your Apple Watch detected over that time that could be potential signs of sleep apnea. Now, one thing that the Series 10 doesn't have, unfortunately, at least for those of us in the US, is blood oxygen saturation tracking, or SpO2, and that's just all due to a lawsuit that was filed by another company previously. You're totally good to go in other countries, but that just hasn't been resolved in the US. Oh, and they also added some new capabilities with double tap, and my favorite is the ability to double tap to scroll through data pages during workouts. Now, I don't necessarily use double tap like during the day for smartwatch related features, but I actually love this feature when I'm cycling, because I can actually look at data pages and kind of scroll through them without taking both hands off the handlebars. It's really, really nice. So on the sports and fitness performance side of things, let's go ahead and start out with GPS accuracy for tracking outdoor workouts. And there's really no changes here with the Series 10 versus the Series 9. And for the total distances that I was collecting, really good on this run here, really good on this right here, and good to go on this right here. Although this right here, it was just ever so slightly lower than the other devices. And then if we take a closer look at the GPS tracks themselves, so on that run, everything looked really good, even through a couple of these tunnels here where it was able to reacquire GPS quickly and didn't falter at all. Really good stuff. And then if we take a look at some of those road rides, for all the straight sections, things look really, really good. Super solid, super crisp, and no wandering or anything like that. However, on some of the corners that I took at higher speeds, there's a little bit of corner cutting here and there where it's not quite as tight as the other devices I was using. And that's maybe where that slight difference in distance came from, at least on that one ride where it was a tiny bit lower than the other devices. And by the way, this is definitely a reason I like to show total distances in my videos in addition to the GPS tracks, because they can have a direct correlation. And if you're curious about how it compares to the Ultra 2, so like on this ride, I was actually wearing both, and you can see that they're very close to one another almost the entire time, but on just a couple of those corners at higher speeds, the Series 10 is just a little bit smoother than the Ultra 2. And the differences are really small in the whole scheme of things, and it is still super reliable, but it's just on some of those higher speed corners where it may not be quite as detailed as some of the other devices. And then on the heart rate accuracy side of things, again, the Series 10 has the same heart rate sensor package as the Series 9, and the Series 9 was already a solid performer. And for how the Series 10 did, so let's first go ahead and start out with some indoor cycling, and these are quite simply a thing of beauty. Indoor cycling is certainly one of the easier activities for these kinds of sensors to get right, but these results are just so darn close that we really have to zoom in extremely close to see any difference at all. These are pretty awesome. Taking it outside though, so this is where we start to throw some things in the mix, like gripping onto handlebars, as well as bumps and vibrations from the road. And this is where we start to see some watches get thrown off a bit from time to time. But the Series 10 still did very well here. Like on this right here, this is almost as accurate as those indoor rides. Again, we really have to zoom in close to see any sort of difference. However, on this ride, we do have a couple spots right here where read high for a few minutes. Nothing earth-shattering, but certainly a little bit off for just a few minutes. But then on this right here, that's again nearly perfect for the entire ride. Oh, and the purple line that you see, by the way, is the Ultra 2 Black. And if you're curious about more details on the differences in accuracy between the Ultra 2 and the Series 10, don't worry, I got you covered because I'm already working a deep dive between those two watches, so definitely stay tuned. And then when it comes to running, so these again are very good results. A couple beats per minute low right here for a couple minutes on this run, but certainly nothing to complain about on both of these runs. Now, when it comes to weight training, so this is one of the most challenging kinds of workouts for a wrist-based optical heart rate sensor to track right. We're gripping onto dumbbells, which tenses our wrist, and then there's also a lot of varying arm movement, both of which can lead to inaccuracies with these kinds of sensors. And Apple Watches have been one of the few watches out there who actually do a decent job, and the Series 10 did a decent job. It did read a little bit high right here on this one set of bench presses, and then two of these high readings right here on these bicep curls, but other than that, that's very good. So with all that, what do I really think about the Series 10? Well, these are some really nice changes overall. Do they make a considerable difference? Well, not necessarily so much if you're coming from a Series 9, but definitely if you're coming from a Series 8, and even more so if you're coming from a Series 7 or older. Like I was mentioning at the beginning of the video, Apple doesn't necessarily reinvent the wheel with each year's Apple Watch release. Well, maybe with the exception with the introduction of the Ultra. Each year is usually about improving and refining, and these are all welcome changes, but not necessarily a reason to upgrade directly from the Series 9. Again, coming from the Series 7 or older, yeah, that could be definitely worth the upgrade. What makes the more noticeable differences, though, are the changes with watchOS 11. We got some great updates this year on the sports and fitness side of things with training load, then plenty of changes on the health side of things with their Vitals app as well as sleep apnea tracking. What's interesting, though, about these year's changes with the Series 10 is that it does bring it a little bit closer with the Ultra, with the display size as well as some of the additional features in the water like snorkeling. It doesn't have the full dive capabilities of the Ultra, but I'd also argue that snorkeling is a lot more accessible than diving. So the question is, how does the Series 10 actually stack up to the Ultra 2? Well, I've got a whole nother video coming up with exactly those details, and not just features, but also accuracy. So make sure to subscribe to the channel to get the full rundown. And if you did find the information in this video to be useful, do me a favor and just quickly hit that like button, as it does definitely help out this video and the channel quite a bit. Thanks so much for watching, and we will see you in the next video.